Welcome to the Resilient Campus Podcast, amplifying the voices of college inclusion innovators. I'm your host, Saby Labor, founder and CEO of Resilient Campus. Join me each week as I interview professionals on the front lines of campus and community movement building. For more information, please visit resilientcampus.com/podcast. Episode number 6 of the Resilient Campus Podcast. Today we're speaking with Dolan from UC Santa Barbara. Dolan is passionate about empowering LGBTQIA plus students through providing support, mentorship, and counterspace for them to grow and reflect. They have been working in the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity at UCSB this past year after 3 years of doing LGBTQIA advocacy work at Washington University in St. Louis. They have a master's in education from the University of Vermont and did their undergraduate work at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Dolan also serves as the Trans Genderqueer chair on the executive board of the Consortium of LGBT resource professionals in higher education. Dolan believes in decentering dominance and knows that racial justice is intrinsic to queer and trans justice. And Dolan also wanted me to say that they think the world of me, Saby, as a mentor and friend. Dolan, thank you so much for joining us and causing me to blush a little bit with that introduction. Thanks for being here, my friend. I appreciate you.
Oh, I appreciate you very much, friend. Thank you so much, and you definitely are a mentor to me.
So I was telling Dolan before we started recording that I'm really excited to get their voice, their insights, and their perspective out to other folks doing this work, because Dolan and I met a few years ago, and we had so many interests and passions and our values lined up in so many ways. And we've just been friends and just sort of encouraging each other from afar because we live in different states. And I've just so appreciated the work that you do, Dolan. And so I really appreciate your time and your energy and the brilliance that you're going to bring as you do every day to this podcast episode. And I know that this, brief bio that you've provided us just is very simple snapshot of all that you bring. Can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? Like, what do you want folks to know?
Thanks again, Saby, for letting me be present with you and for sharing some time and space with me. As you said, my name is Dolan. I use they, them pronouns, and I work at UC Santa Barbara, UCSB, in the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. I recently became the director here in the center. And it still feels very surreal to me. When I was going through my master's degree process, I told myself, someday I want to be a director of a queer resource center. And I thought, this could take forever. And here I am doing this work, and I just feel infinitely grateful and humbled. And the impostor syndrome is real. And just trying to find a way to stay steeled in that confidence and empowered, and to make sure to keep, passing the mic around and using my space to lift others up as much as possible. So, as you said, I was at WashU in St. Louis for 3 years before this doing LGBTQ work. And so we didn't really have an LGBTQ resource center there. So transitioning from doing that work in a student life type office as a kind of office of one doing the resource work with counterparts doing Greek life and leadership work, I learned a lot in a different way. And now coming here and having more of a shared mission, a larger team to do queer resource work, and to have kind of more campus partners, since I'm on a much larger campus, to share the work and be able to really talk about justice in a different way. It's been a real privilege. So I'm super grateful.
For folks that have this conceptual awareness of what the imposter syndrome is, they might be nodding or snapping their fingers as you're saying that it is real for you. What about for those folks that may just be arriving to that as a concept, or may have that experience but are without the language at this point in time? Can you tell us what the imposter syndrome looks like for you in your personal life and your professional life? How do you experience that for other folks to know how that is for you, how you live that out?
Absolutely. So when I think about imposter syndrome and what that concept looks like, I think about stereotype threat, which is this idea of marginalized people underperforming because they're expected to perform less, right? So queer, trans people, people of color, maybe first-gen college students, undocumented people, people where English isn't their first language, whatever that might be, knowing that when folks or the society expects less of marginalized people, and then we show up and underperform because we don't see ourselves reflected in places of leadership, right? We don't have as many possibility models. So I think about stereotype threat a lot, and then just this idea of like when implicit bias, when you're kind of dealing with that all the time, this idea of like other people, you know, holding this bias against people or people like you. And generally, especially during times of transition, I think imposter syndrome shows up because there's less trust, less safety, psychologically, emotionally, sometimes physically as well, right, to be able to really show up in an authentic way. So when I think about imposter syndrome, I think about barriers to being able to show up authentically, barriers to being able to achieve at your capacity and reach your potential and be able to, have the impact that you see yourself having. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you so much. And I'm a firm believer that, this concept of self-identity and self-expression and self-definition of our own experiences are really important as we do this work, because the ways in which someone listening to this podcast might experience the imposter syndrome might have a lot in common with what you just explained, and they might have some pretty nuanced differences that, are unique to them. And so I love to play with the social construction of language and see exactly how you're centering yourself in that experience. And I just appreciate you sharing it so much.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Dolan, tell us which identities are the most salient for you today?
I love to joke that I am a identity straddler. I am biracial. I am white and very light-skinned and also Latinx. My mom was born in Cuba and is an immigrant. And then on top of that, right, there are white Cubans, brown, indigenous Cubans, there are Black Cubans, there are all kinds of Cubans, right? And it's just very complicated, and that cultural identity is so politicized as well, right? It's so hard to decouple a Cuban and a political identity, since so much of that country and that culture is infused by what communism means and the political nature of the Castro regime, et cetera, right? And so having to figure out what my cultural identity and then also my racial identity really looks like, and figure out my own politics, separate that from stories and narratives I've heard about what it means to be Cuban from my own family, and then kind of reintegrate that for myself has been really complex, but that's something I'm constantly working on. The other binaries I straddle, I identify as non-binary, as genderqueer, and for me, gender is very fluid, and so I use they, them pronouns, as we both mentioned earlier, and on top of that, I'm bisexual or queer, and so I have kind of a lot of these binaries that I move in and out of sometimes, or live in just a totally different space of sometimes, that can be a little bit confusing, right? When a lot of people tend to ground themselves on where are you on this spectrum that's anchored by this binary, right? From left to right or up to down. And I feel like I just need a third dimension to explain some of those identities. I love to throw in that I'm also a Gemini. So that duality is there. It's very real for me. So all the dualities I kind of feel like I live in and out of in some ways. I am not a first-generation college student and grew up, I think my family would say, definitely climbed some middle-class ladder while I was growing up. As I mentioned, my mom was an immigrant. My dad grew up very working class and had to put himself through college, but was able to go to college. And so I have a lot of privilege in that way, and definitely grew up with an expectation of going to college. So that had a big way of shaping my experience, and definitely, I think, lifted me up in a lot of ways, right? Created privilege for me. So I definitely had support from my family going to college. I think that's it.
I mean, thank you so much for sharing all of that. That's a lot. And, you and I met because we were both engaging in work, lifting up the experiences of bisexual, pansexual, fluid, and queer students. And I'm just so grateful that we met around that topic that was, and is a passion for both of us. And I'm just so grateful that we continue to discover that we have a lot of similar experiences and similar passions. I know that one of the last times we saw each other was at, I believe it was the Consortium Institute, and we were in a mixed race group together. And then, I saw you again this summer at another consortium, gathering, and it was, centering Indigenous and people of color identities from a queer and trans intersectionality lens, right? And so I just continue to see you in these spaces where we have so much in common. It just reminds me that we are moving along, trying to engage folks in a way that meets them where they are, and that you're just a phenomenal leader in these spaces. And so I just continue to be so humbled by you and your awareness of all your identities and trying to expand those notions as well. So, as you're speaking about like a third dimension or another dimension, to be able to talk about these outside of binary, right? So that's really important.
Oh, well, you are being hecka humble right now. Dear listeners, please know that Saby delivered a beautiful keynote at that institute this summer, and that they are available for speaking engagements at your institution.
Wow.
They are the best.
I see what Dolan's doing there. Dolan, tell us about the work that you're doing today around college inclusion efforts at UCSB.
Yeah, so like you mentioned before, I work in the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, which is similar to a queer resource center or trans resource center on a lot of our college campuses nationally. And I think it's important just to note that that's the work that I've been doing since I entered student affairs. I was working in the LGBTQIA Center at the University of Vermont as a graduate assistant. There I also worked in the Women's Center and the Alana Student Center, which is the African American, Latinx, Asian, Native American, bi-multiracial student center. And then when I was at WashU, I did queer work, and here as well. So that identity-based work is really the work that I feel called to do, and really grateful to serve in this capacity on these campuses. I think with that said, recognizing, like you said earlier, right, like that queer justice and racial justice are intrinsically connected, and that there is no way to eradicate homophobia without also eradicating racism, right? And I like to think a lot about critical race theory, which I know maybe isn't exactly what you're asking, but I've been reflecting on critical race theory a lot, especially this summer, because I think it's an important part of the mission of the work that we do here, right? This like idea that if we end and eradicate racism, homophobia will end too, right? And so as I've been trying to think about revising the mission and vision and values of our center and the RCSGD, I've been reading a lot of critical race theory by Richard Delgado and Derek Bell, and just trying to really situate myself there and center myself, and thinking about how do we build new revisionist histories, right? Like talking about how our histories have been stripped from us, right? And these false narratives are being told, right, about what it means to be a colonizer, right? How Indigenous people there was a mass genocide, right? This like critique of liberalism, right? And I think about that in such a strong way, especially following this election, right? This idea of what a two-party system does to us and how it polarizes us, but then also how there were so many people that saw themselves aligned with the work that we did for queer justice and still said that they were colorblind, right? And I'm sitting here going, that's not the work, right? We have to be conscious of identity when we're talking about this, and colorblindness really only serves white people, right? And so those are some of the things that I've been thinking a lot about this summer. Especially to this last piece that I've been thinking a lot about is how empathy is a fallacy when it comes to being a tool of liberation, right? Like empathy is so important and it's great. And for any strength quest lovers out there, it's my top strength, right? I love empathy. It's super important. And it's really exhausting also for those of us who are empaths. And it's not going to get us free, right? It oftentimes trails this conversation around free speech, and I think that's a really important thing to be talking about right now on our campuses, especially those of us at large publics, right, that are very connected to our state laws, right, and don't have as much agility as some private schools. But this idea of, just keep talking back at bad or hate speech, right? This idea that you can change someone's mind or you can win over someone's heart with empathy, it's just not going to liberate us. And so I think a lot about CRT, or critical race theory, in the work, because it's very, it's common to think about queer theory and feminist theory, and those are very important. And I think we need to get to our roots and talk a lot about racism in the work too. Another reason I think about this is because so many people still come up to me as campus partners, and I'm so grateful for this, and are seeking out an LGBTQ training. A lot of campuses call them safe zone trainings or things like that. And those same folks or departments oftentimes are a lot less likely to seek out racial justice trainings or talks about racism, right? And I want to challenge that a little, because for some reason, folks are at a place where they're saying they've arrived when it comes to racism. We're post-racial, quote unquote, which is a very harmful dynamic. And at the same time, they're like, but we have things to learn about our trans students, right? And I want to challenge them and say, first of all, what about our trans students of color, right? And second of all, I think anytime we think we've arrived when it comes to racism ending, right, that's really just the racism talking, right? And so those are some things that I've been thinking about. Not sure if I answered your question.
No, I love it. There's so much in there, right? Even the last piece that you're saying about, I think about the ways in which capitalism, equips us or kind of deeply embeds this idea that we can arrive, and that achieving any one single outcome that you can quantify is actually the arrival point and is your goal to achieve. And I think that really kind of flips the paradigm for a lot of people, right? In this individualistic, capitalist society where, okay, we go to a safe zone training, get the placard or get the, certificate, done, check it off the list. And knowing that language and terminology and student experiences shift daily, if not by the minute, right? And so, it's not this idea of an ongoing dialogue. And I love that you brought that up, just because it's something that, our advocates, our allies, they cannot be under the assumption that they can just check it off their list in this, and I'm sort of envisioning like this very short list of, okay, get anti-racist training, check. Learn what white supremacy means, check, right? And it's like, okay, well, you can't just check off definitions and kind of go to one training or a series of trainings and think that you've arrived. It's ongoing work.
Absolutely. And I think so often that comes from white fragility, right? Whiteness or people with whiteness. And I include myself in that, right? I like to kind of include myself in white and POC spaces because I need to challenge my whiteness. And I also need to do some racial healing. So it's complicated as a mixed race person, right? But especially with a lot of privilege around light skin, right? This concept around not being able to name racism, I think, like I said, comes from white fragility and this fear that if we admit we have work to do around our racism, then we look like a bad white person, quote unquote, right? And so I just think I'd rather step forward and do that than try to continue to perpetuate that quote unquote good white person narrative, which is super harmful to people of color, right? And I think too often we're really just frozen in that fear of looking bad, right, on our campuses and admitting if we have racial justice work still yet to do, learning to do still about racism, which we, like, spoiler alert, always will have that learning to do, right? Always will have that work to do. That once we admit that, then that means that we've never started, right? Where I actually think it's the opposite, right? If we're foolish enough to think that we're post-racial, then we probably really haven't started the real deep work that we need to do on the racism in our bodies. Yeah, so I think that's connected completely to queer justice. I think that especially as we think about all of the trans people of color who've been murdered and are being murdered all the time in our own country, in our own streets, right? I work on a college campus in California, and moving here from Missouri, there has been a lot of conversations I've had where people have tried to say to me, well, you moved here from the Midwest. You moved here from a red state. You moved here from a more rural area. We don't have that work to do here, right? Our state goes blue in the elections, right? And I just think that's really problematic and frightening to hear, because we absolutely have conservative people here. We have white supremacists here, right? We have white supremacy here in our bodies. And so the more we distance ourselves, the less we're doing the work. And so anyway, I think not only is queer justice completely connected to racial justice, but I think as folks doing queer justice work, we have a real important opportunity to raise that work up when often, for some reason, I'm still kind of figuring this out and would love to talk to folks who are interested in talking about this. For some reason, people are still willing to say they have something to learn about queer and trans people, but they're more fearful to say that about people of color, right? So I think it's part of our duty to really be talking about racial justice as much as possible as a queer resource center for that reason as well.
Absolutely. You know, it reminds me of there was an article in the last year or so about college presidents that are in complete denial that racism exists on their campuses, right? It's like this complete, like that doesn't happen here. College campuses are a microcosm of a larger society. Of course, racism exists on your campus. And actually, you know, it's kind of running rampant in many ways. In terms of like college presidents being the ones that are, you know, the outward face in the public, you know, and private community building or the community partnerships that they're engaged in building and developing. It's really scary to think that, you know, many of our college presidents are not acknowledging the fact that racism is an issue that they need to deal with. And I totally agree with you. I think people are more apt to say, I have this area to grow in because I don't know anything about queer and trans issues. And kind of get jumbled up in even saying some of the letters, right? And get a little vulnerable and maybe, act, you know, accordingly. I don't know. It's just such an interesting dynamic, one. And I think it leads me to another question that I have for you that kind of came up because you just shared so much. There's so many layers to what you just shared. But one, I hear this from a lot of graduate students, but I also think, you know, seasoned practitioners are often looking for newer or completely new ways to use theory in their practice as practitioners. And you mentioned CRT or critical race theory in your daily practice. And Dolan, are there ways that when you have used critical race theory in your practice on college campuses that you can provide strategies or insights to other practitioners who maybe struggle with applying theory to practice?
I think a lot about what queer and trans people of color might need from white people in these scenarios. And a friend and colleague of mine, Mark Chung Kwon Fan, he's the assistant director at the Spectrum Center at the University of Michigan. He and I did a really small non-IRB study where we talked to some of our colleagues across the country who were QTPOC, queer and trans people of color, just went through a job transition and what they needed from their supervisors. And we kind of underpinned it in CRT, right? So what it means to put critical race theory into practice and tried to create the more tools and strategies for especially white folks and white supervisors of QTPOC professionals. So some of those things that we came up with were, and again, these were from our participants as well, right, was even simple things like getting pronouns right, being able to avoid microaggressive terms, acknowledging when people make mistakes, apologizing, moving on, naming impact, not using queer and trans people of color's achievements for your own benefit, right? Recognizing that there's a pipeline to this work and supporting access to that pipeline. So starting from students, right? That is the work that we do. And that impacts our professionals, right? And supporting them as they're going into a PhD program or trying to better themselves through an internship or whatever that might be, right? Checking in with folks, especially around national and local events, and understanding that there's a grieving process for that. Knowing that this work is not apolitical, right? That QTPOC existence is political and politicized, that just like restrooms are not inherently political, trans people's lives around restrooms have become politicized, right? And what that means. And so when so often I think we're afraid to make a political statement, quote unquote, we have to recognize that the only way to do this work sometimes is to be political because it's become political, right? And that was a tactic, right, of white supremacy, of the alt-right, et cetera, to silence us, right, in the work. And so if we're too afraid to be political in the work, then we're not going to be able to engage the work at all, right? Because they're drawing those boundaries really tightly around us. And we've got to be unafraid and unapologetic to cross that line when we have that safety, right? And recognizing that sometimes our work is to agitate, right? Agitate these systems, that these systems weren't built for queer and trans people of color and other people without dominant identities to succeed, right? I mean, we need to know our history, and we can get into that if you want, but like this idea of even higher education institutions, how do we shift the narrative to serve these students instead of trying to fit them into a dominant narrative, right? Challenging respectability politics, especially around advancement. So like, oh, you're not dressing professionally, you're not speaking professionally, you're not playing nice, right? How do we support and protect our QTPOC professionals in their advancement and also protect their authenticity, right? And I think a lot about like panning, right? This like idea of like looking around the room, panning the room and getting a sense of who's speaking, who's being heard, who has political capital in this space, who makes decisions, right? And thinking about identity, right? Because oftentimes it's white folks, white cis het men, right? And who has to mute parts of themselves? And that's an ableist term, I apologize. Who has to kind of, turn the volume down on parts of their identities in order to be successful, right? And how can we move past empathy as our only tool, right? Because we can't rely on that, right? Like I said, and so recognizing that, saying that the only way to contest hate speech or bad speech, mean speech, if it doesn't count as hate speech, whatever that looks like, right, is with more speech, recognizing the labor that takes on people of color to have to do that, right? And recognizing, too, that it's not always possible when it's anonymous, right, when they're getting hate mail or whatever that looks like, right? And that especially when, the N-word or really intense language is being used, hateful, violent language is being used against people, or really deeply embedded stereotypes are being used against people, that there's no way to just undo that for people, right? It's deeply embedded in our culture and society. And so there's no way to talk back or add more speech around stereotypes, right? You're basically asking us to debate for our livelihood and existence, right? So I think we need to find a new way through this free speech debate, and it's not always with quote unquote more speech, right? I think too often hate speech, again, is a political term, right? It's a, Department of Justice term, right? It's a legal term. And so how do we interpret that for our campus and hold ourselves to that? Write out some value statements, write out some legal code on our campuses about it, and then draw the lines and defend the lines, right? When folks step over that line, there are consequences, and here are what they are. And the one last thing I want to just share is I struggle so much because I'm on a public institution campus, and I recognize that we are on public land. The land that I'm standing on is Chumash land, right? It's the Chumash Nation of Southern California in the Santa Barbara area, right? And so I am standing on land stolen from the Chumash people by white colonizers, Spanish colonizers, building missions in this area, right, decades, centuries ago. But we continue to perpetuate that and be complicit in that process. And have to use local laws, right, to enforce things. And there are free speech spaces, and I'm still learning what all of that means. I think I will always be learning what all that means, but I just think we have to be really thoughtful about our fear and fragility around making some of those rules and enforcing our rules around that, right? I think too often the free speech debate ends up centering dominance, centering whiteness, centering people who are like, oh, well, I should be able to say this. This is a free speech zone, right? But we're not a values-neutral institution. None of us are, right? And we need to be able to articulate what our values are, what it means to be at UCSB, what it means to be at WashU, at UVM, whatever institution we're at, and say, this is what it means to be here. This is what it means to be part of our community, right? And here's who we're here to protect. This is what our mission is, right? We are a values-based, educational, mission-driven institution. So neutral language doesn't exist here. So let's stop trying to pretend that we are politically neutral when we are not. So those are just some things that I'm thinking about, because I think too often we kind of duck and dodge this conversation with neutrality, but there is no neutrality at this point. And we've really got to be thoughtful about that, but this is the time to be bold more than ever.
So I want to go back to the study that you and your colleague did a couple of years ago. Is that available anywhere for folks to access online?
We just did it this past year, and we don't have it available online yet, but we are planning to do a webinar with the Consortium of LGBTQ resource professionals in higher ed in a couple weeks. So early September, we hope to be doing a webinar of this year, 2017. So hopefully folks can check that out. And then we will also make that available on the consortium's website, which is lgbtcampus.org. It'll be live there after the date that it airs.
Wonderful. And I'll put that link in the show notes for people that just want a quick reference to everything we talk about in this episode that has an online trail.
Great. Thank you.
Dolan, when you were talking, it just reminded me how campuses are really struggling with conversations around white fragility, around having a race as a white person, having or talking about dynamics of white supremacy and what it means to be a white supremacist. And I think that you have really centered this idea of applying a critical race theory lens, because it really does center the systems of oppression in which, are racialized in this country, and not just our country, but just speaking to U.S. dynamics at this point, I think would really help folks to understand that when we talk about whiteness and we talk about white supremacy, that when we center a critical race theory lens, you're looking at it from a place that acknowledges racism exists. And let's talk about it from there, right? This country was built on racist practices and a very violent history of doing so, of genocide, like you mentioned in the beginning. And I just feel like, even just starting from that simple, and I don't mean to oversimplify it. I don't mean to say start from that simple deduction, because for me, it just feels like, let's just start there. Let's just start with that acknowledgement and then move from there. So I appreciate everything you're bringing forward. I'm really excited to hear more about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, because that was, that's an important statement that racism is real, right? Like racism exists is the first tenet, right? The most foundational tenet of CRT. So thank you for sharing that.
So you talked a little bit about the work that you're doing today at UCSB around queer and trans liberation and justice. How did you arrive to the work that you're doing today? Like what kind of brought you along this path to center your work around queer and trans liberation?
That's a great question. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Mm-hmm. I have always been drawn to queer and trans communities, and I hesitate to say this, but coming into some of my own identities really helped me reflect on what it meant to be part of this community, right? So being able to come into my queerness, come into my transness, right? But really way, way, way bigger than me, being able to connect with a community that has been a family and really think about our history and our power, right? And our ancestors, right? I think the work that we do is really sacred and important. And so when I think about arriving at the work, I think a lot about what it means to be of service. And this feels like my way of being of service to others, and to connect with others and to connect them with themselves, right? I think about resiliency, like, your resilient campus, right? I think that word is so important, and we need to talk about how resilient our communities already are, right? And then figure out a way to kind of reclaim that term, right, from oppressors who sometimes say to us, just be more resilient, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think being a little bit underrepresented in college and feeling confused and pushed aside in my own studies. I don't often share this with people. I'm like hesitating to share this, but I was an engineering major in college, and that's what my bachelor's is in. And so feeling very kind of, underrepresented in those spaces as someone who was straddling all these identities, coming into their own experiences, figuring out what life really looked like. It took me longer to really go through identity development processes because I didn't have models for that, right? There were no non-binary, biracial, bisexual people that I could connect to immediately, right? So many others who were able to model some of those identities for me and show me what it looked like to be resilient, right? And so in grad school, I did that research around bisexuality in students, like you mentioned, with bi, pan, fluid, and queer students, and what their experiences were like in hetero spaces and queer spaces. And it felt like coming home. And so I realized how much connection can come from being able to talk to each other and find similar experiences and echo each other and support each other and lift each other up. And I just felt like that was, I don't know, there's something that feels really invincible, right, about finding people like you for the first time ever. And that's kind of how I got pulled into the work and started, but I try not to situate myself there too much, right? Because, again, like I mentioned earlier, I have so much privilege, and this work isn't about me, right, just me. It's really about decentering myself in this work, right, being able to find some commonality, right, and validate and affirm people's identity in a very deep inner knowing, but also recognizing that doesn't do everything, right? So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still kind of processing that, right? Like, how did I arrive to the work, and how am I continuing to arrive to the work? It feels complicated to me, right? And I'm still trying to figure out how to decenter myself in that.
One thing that I'll say, Dolan, is that when I've talked with students, I did an internship with the amazing folks at UC Riverside and their LGBT Resource Center a few years ago, and was able to talk with a lot of the directors and coordinators and staff in those spaces, but also interviewing students on what attracts them to these LGBTQ resource centers, what kind of repels them or pushes them out of these spaces if they ever arrive to them in the first place. And one of the themes that came up around what students are looking for and what they really appreciate and stay around to receive the support that these centers have is looking at, especially our bi, pan, fluid students, our students that are queer identified or outwardly express that they are bisexual. These students are really looking for possibility models in these LGBT resource centers. And what I found was that when the director or the coordinator or some staff was visibly out as a bisexual person or had a queer identity and really defined it in such a way that was, attraction to people of multiple genders, people of all body types and expressions, right? That there was then room for them to have that identity in a way that in some of the other centers, they kind of noted, well, I don't even know what that looks like to be maybe a professional with that identity or to have a positive central identity around being bisexual, right? Having a positive experience around it because there's so much stigma still today around having a bisexual identity. And so our students need to see you in these roles. They need to see you as a biracial person. They need to see you as someone that talks about, light skin privilege, like someone that talks about being Cuban and all the different, experiences that entails. And so I just feel like so grateful that you're in that role because you have, whether you know it or not on a daily basis, you're having that impact on students simply by being the human being that you are and all your complexity. So I feel like you're leaving that door open for students to know that they can come seek you out whenever they need you, and maybe they won't need you, right, in any direct way, and maybe you're just doing that kind of supportive, you're providing that supportive experience from afar just by being who you are. I hear you trying to decenter yourself and And I think that there's always that ebb and flow, that tension that exists for us when we are maybe a one person shop, or when we are that queer or trans person, or queer and trans person on campus, and we're that tokenized person. And so I know that tension exists. And I know also that, simultaneously what can be acknowledged is that you're doing amazing work just by being that person that does have these identities and is also engaged in this constant state of arrival, if you will.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, for some reason, my life is like a boomerang back to imposter syndrome, right? It's this not only this feeling of enoughness in the work, but enoughness in the identities, right? And so being able to see people model that bisexuality for me felt really powerful, right? And feeling queer enough is a really problematic epidemic in our community, right? Mm-hmm. And being political enough, being radical enough, being gay, queer, trans enough, whatever that looks like, is complicated, right? And we all know it's self-defined, and I could break out into a safe zone training right now, but I won't, right? But I think our students experience that, and I remember that, and I live that, right? And I think it's important for us to have that space for ourselves as well, to keep the healing process going, for us to remember that we are enough. And that's one of those things I'll have to continually be reminding the students that I work with. And I will ask my mentors to try to remind me as well and to challenge me. But I think those are the important things we need to keep remembering.
Thank you for sharing that. So Dolan, the next question is really to glean a little bit of some of the either personal or professional or both, some of those resources that you tap into that inform the way that you think about or the way that you approach your work in college environments. Can you share maybe a book or a podcast or some resource that centers the way that you approach this work?
I love books so much. They're so important to me. They're my best friends. And I have been having a summer of reading all QT-POC fiction. So that's been really fun. And I definitely recommend people take the time to read some QT-POC fiction written by QT-POC people to really recenter what it looks like to imagine worlds outside of this one. Too often, the only access to fiction we have is super dominant and these classics, which are great and very valuable. And when we can really immerse ourselves in QT-POC fiction, it gives us a whole new universe to just imagine in. And that's how we can stay innovative with our strategies. It sounds silly, but I really think it works. Otherwise, the fun QT-POC fiction, I mean, I would say the CRT is something I've really been spending a ton of time with. So Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Jean Stefanchik, some of these authors are amazing, and their books are great. They just came out with a new critical race theory book this past year. It's the third edition from 2017 that came out, and I find it to be extremely accessible. It's only like 120 pages. It's a small book, and it almost feels like bullet points, very short paragraphs, very digestible. You could take a chapter a day and really sit with it. And I love to journal, so I love to just kind of consume those things and journal about them and try to just generate thoughts from there. Otherwise, one other thing I would mention is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. It's just such a classic, and I just feel like I'll never, ever tire of it. It's important, and we need to be continuing to think about education and liberation and, how to really liberate ourselves and each other, connect others to liberation, right? And that makes me think of one last one. I know I've said that already, but Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. That's another really great foundational book that I've really appreciated, specifically around education and liberation.
So you mentioned your QT-POC summer reading list. Can you give us a couple of titles? Like if people wanted to have the fall season or the fall semester, because there's so much time, extra time that we have in the fall semester.
Yeah, of course, right?
Like what are those QT-POC titles that you're just like, you have to read this, start here. If you have not engaged in QT-POC centered, fiction, start here. What would be that book for you?
So for me, the first one I think I read, at least that I can remember is The Summer We Got Free by Mia Mackenzie.
Yes.
Mia Mackenzie is also Black Girl Dangerous. It is such a beautiful book. It's short. It's situated in Philly for anyone who has a Philly connection. It's a beautiful book, murder mystery, just romance. I mean, the whole nine. It's gorgeous. Another one of my favorites is Juliet Takes a Breath I think it's by Gabby Rivera. And she's the one who recently redid the superhero series where it's like America punches Nazis in the face and she's a queer Latina. Anyway, she's amazing. So Juliet Takes a Breath is actually not about that, but it's about a young Puerto Rican queer girl growing up in the Bronx who spends the summer in Portland, Oregon, and kind of navigates whiteness and toxicity and comes into her identity. It's beautiful. So those are two that I would say are absolute must-reads. Drop everything and read those two books. They will change your life. But I have more books I would recommend as well, but those are just my faves.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you. You're just like, you're always sharing things that I'm adding to my list. Like, oh, Dolan's doing this. I need to, of course, like we're usually pretty interested in the same thing. So I'm just going to put that on my list too. So thanks for those recommendations. So the next question, and it's a big question, and I know it, and I almost say like, sorry, question mark, that it's such a big question. But what's that biggest lesson that you've learned in your professional life that you want to share with people that are listening in?
The two things that I think about are what it means to be enough. I'm still finding ways to put this into words. My first year as a professional outside of grad school, I had a hard time. There was a lot of transition going on at the institution I was at. I felt a little bit caught in the dark a few times and just had a lot of those kind of new professional moments, lots of growing pains, lots of learning. And I think mentorship is just critical. I know that that's something that almost anyone will say to you, but I'll just say it again. So freaking important to find those people who will ground you, who will give you that wisdom, who will share that with you, who know you well enough to be able to say, hey, I got your back and let me tell you this thing that you need to know about yourself. And I just say with that, like with mentors, be gentle, right? Just be gentle with yourself because there are going to be times when you get some really tough feedback. I've been there. And it's helpful to be able to take it in, let it sit, make some meaning from it, and then breathe through it, right? Let it go. There may be times where it's going to be there forever because it's really hard stinging feedback, and I've been there for sure. Almost like professional trauma, right? Where like either the feedback really is through and through a gift that's just really hard to swallow, or maybe it's coming out of left field a little, right? Maybe it's a little bit unfair. And I've been there, right? And having to kind of put yourself back together and trust yourself enough to say, I have a lot to learn, right? Not to be too proud to let some of that sink in, but not to let it take you all the way down, right? Because the worthiness and enoughness thing is critical. And there are days where we just have to do that for ourselves because no one else is going to do that for us, right? No one else is going to tell you you are enough, you are doing enough, you are being enough. And you're going to get all these kind of messages that say otherwise, right? And so being able to really ground yourself enough to believe that, it takes a lot of practice, and there are a lot of days I fail at it, but trying to remind yourself how important that is, right? Because otherwise we can lose hope or lose focus really easily in this really hard work, really exhausting, sometimes damaging work, right? Where we can feel like we're all out alone, swimming against the current, and remembering that we're not, reconnecting with those mentors, and hearing the feedback, letting it sink in, and then also taking breaks and taking breaths and, recharging your batteries.
I love that. There's this conversation in the corporate arena around mentorship versus sponsorship, right? And one is like, I'm going to kind of mirror for you or model for you the ways in which you can kind of see the remnants of socialization, the professional socialization that happens. And this is, let me give you that feedback. And then sponsorship being that kind of next level of action and actually clearing obstacles and providing them a clear path to advancement and promotion and getting them to their next goal. So it's kind of like, Dr. John Paul said it in the last episode really well, but just kind of this lifting, kind of this remnant of Audre Lorde's like lifting as I climb mentality but kind of like paving the way so that you can say, this is how you get here too. And I'm going to actually bring you with me to the space that you want to go. So it's really been interesting to me to see some of the practices that are being implemented in the corporate arena. And often in higher ed, we don't think that would apply to us, right? Because we really struggle with this privatization of higher ed and taking from models where they might see their clients as customers and, as numbers. And we're kind of like, we like to be at the polar opposite end of that. And I think that there's some practices that have merit in higher education environments, such as sponsorship programs, right? Because they're kind of like moving. I see the parallels in the ally to advocate conversation, right? It's like one seems a little less active it seems like a stasis situation of mentoring. Sometimes people don't know exactly how to do it. And then sponsorship being like, I'm going to pull, like, let's be an active conversation about where you want to go. And then let me actually help you to make that happen. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I feel like one is a little more active than the other.
I love that. I hadn't heard about that. So I would love to just go deeper with you at some point on that. Thank you so much for offering that.
I love it. And I think, and I want to say that although there might be a semantic difference, I think that many mentoring relationships are already fulfilling that really active spirit of, let me just clear these obstacles that are caused by, systematic oppression, for example, right? And like, versus kind of like what we've traditionally labeled as mentorship. So I think that it's already in practice. And I think there's just kind of some newer language around it, although one could argue newer language doesn't mean it hasn't been happening in the past, right?
Yeah, but it's great to be able to recognize the good things that are happening, right? And as you're saying that, I really appreciate that framework because I'm thinking, I have mentors and I have sponsors, right? And I'm doing a disservice by naming all of my mentors the same, right? When that's just not true, right? I have a lot of people that I am so privileged to know who have mentored me. And then I know people who have, put some skin in the game for me and really worked hard to kind of lift me up and paved ways and pulled down barriers. So it's really helpful for me to think of it that way. And I'm going to reflect on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like that's what you do in your practice is you do sponsorship, and I wasn't going to throw you out there because I know it makes you like real blushy and stuff, but I feel like what you're doing is sponsorship. So we can talk about that later. I'm just going to put that right there, for us to talk about later if you want.
That would be great.
Awesome. So Dolan, another big question as we close out our interview time together. What is that one piece of guidance that you would give to professionals doing equity and inclusion work in today's higher ed environments?
That's a great question. So one thing that I've been reflecting on a lot as I've been thinking about CRT this past summer and this past year is decentering dominance versus inclusion, right? I think we use a lot of buzzwords in our work, and sometimes it's almost like we creep away from what those words were intended to do. Inclusion sounds really great. And in my head, and in this real conceptual form, it's not that great, right? It's kind of a dim word. It's including marginalized people back into this dominant narrative, right? And I sit with that and I'm like, look, I don't want to teach queer people straight leadership, right? I don't want to say, here's what it's like to be heterosexual. Here's how you can be included in that life, right? I want to say to them, show me your amazing queerness, right? Shine as bright as possible. And I want to just capture your leadership, right? I want to see it in its fullness, in its brightness, right? And I want to just be able to see you manifest that in your power, right? And help you do that, help you harness that. And so I think a lot about decentering dominance. And I think that comes from being able to name it, right? Like naming dominance is the first step. So naming that when we're talking about leadership, like too often we're talking about white, cis, straight, middle class, upper class, et cetera, educated, citizen leadership, right? And what does it mean to be able to, A, recognize multiple forms of leadership, and B, decenter the narrative of leadership outside of that, right? And really, engage and talk about, recenter what that looks like for a marginalized person, right? So I don't know if that makes sense or if that just sounds like some buzzwords, but I just think, we have to learn what people of color leadership looks like, right? What their strengths are, what resiliency skills has already been manifested to survive, to exist, right? We know that marginalized people of color, queer and trans people are resilient by nature. That's why they're still here, right? They are perceptive. We have been able to make it to this point. So I think we have a lot to learn from listening to that instead of trying to, include people in what already exists. Does that make sense?
I really, really love that.
Yeah. It's like, I don't want to make people of color kind of force fit into white structures, and maybe people of color don't feel like they belong here because these places weren't built for them, right? So how can we rebuild these places, restructure, reformat these places, these services, right? How do we put them in the center and say, we want you to lead from the center, right? Not from the top. We don't need hierarchy, right? But how do we have you lead us from the center and we support you all along the way, right? Instead of that inclusion narrative, which I just think is a little bit more colorblind, identity blind, right?
Dolan, I feel like I'm going to be thinking about that for days, if not weeks, because, and let me tell you why. It's because, in kind of this entrepreneurial journey, I've been trying to locate language that actually would bring folks to the table across a spectrum of kind of levels of awareness of education around diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, topics. And even landing on inclusion, it never feels right in my body, right? Like it feels like there's a guttural something there where I'm like, I know that we'll find better language soon. I don't know what it is. And I feel like you just added to my toolkit a real, conversation starter, even if it's just kind of me thinking about how this brings people to the table or not, how they might be having a guttural reaction to the word inclusion as well when I use it with Resilient Campus. And I would love to just have a larger conversation about what language do we feel comes from the centers of our communities speaking to our experience around the work that we do. I would just, that's always necessary. So I appreciate you so much. I have a lot to think about as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you. I mean, this has been a really awesome dialogue, and I'm always learning from you, Saby. And so I feel like if anything, if I could just be a mirror, right, and just try to keep perpetuating as much as I've learned from you, then I will try to do as well as I can, right? But I'm just grateful. You have been a mentor and a sponsor to me, which is a new framework for me, and I'm really excited about that. You have been a lantern for me, right? Someone who has kind of lit the way and made it possible for me to see myself in this work and see myself kind of creating the change that I believe in. And you've always been someone that is very humble and grounded in the work, which I appreciate so much, right? I never see you kind of self-promote, lift yourself up. Every time you're on the mic, you are lifting others up, and I'm grateful to you. So thank you for being the leader that I hope to be someday, right? And for kind of, I don't know, bringing me through it in a lot of ways. So thank you for everything.
Thank you, Dolan. I mean, for folks listening in, you can't see how red my face is. And, I'm Filipino and Hawaiian. It takes a lot for me to get, red in the face, with my, it's hard to tell. I like to joke, especially in the summer, maybe in the winter here in Minnesota, it's I'm just super fair complexioned. But anyway, so side note. But today, I'm blushing a lot. So I really appreciate you, Dolan. And I did not pay Dolan to say those things, folks. So just know that.
Definitely not.
I'm surprised as you are. Yeah. So Dolan, that is a fantastic way to close out. I think the last thing that I'd like for listeners to be able to have is a way to connect with you, because if I've known anything about our friendship over the years, it's that you are just such an essential ingredient in this whole liberation effort that is going on today. And I just so appreciate you. And I know that other folks would want to add you to their network, consult with you when they're thinking about and processing through imposter syndrome, and maybe sharing CRT resources, back and forth, et cetera. So, we need folks like you in our ever expanding network. So what's the best way for people to connect with you, Dolan?
I would love to connect with anyone. And really, like I said earlier, the only way I've gotten here is by the grace of so many people who have taken me under their wing. My LinkedIn is Christine Dolan. Facebook is also Christine Dolan, and I think my Twitter is @ChristineDolan. So I very much welcome people reaching out to me for a phone call or just a chat if you are looking for support or mentorship or just guidance. And even if that's not me, just a way to connect you to someone. Again, that's really how I feel like I've been able to be here. So anything I can do to support someone in their journey or learn from you if you're willing to share from your journey, I'd love that.
That's wonderful. And I'll put those links in the show notes so folks can just click on that and connect with you ASAP so that they won't have to search around the interwebs for your information. Dolan, thank you so much for being with me today and sharing your insights with other professionals and other folks doing this work today. So I know it's not much, but as a token of my gratitude for your time, I would like to send you some very limited edition Resilient Campus swag. So you can expect that in the mail pretty soon.
That's exciting.
And Dolan provided an amazing inspirational quote today. So I want to close out with that inspirational quote to send you all back out into the world. Today's quote comes from Audre Lorde, and this is an excerpt from The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action that was published in 1977. Audre Lorde says, "In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my morality and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be, priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted were my silences. Of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death. But we all hurt in so many different ways, all the time, and pain will either change or end. Death, on the other hand, is the final silence. I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you." To all those listening in, thank you so much for all that you do. I truly appreciate you. Stay resilient. Thanks so much for tuning in. Head on over to iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on a single episode.